Hello everybody, my name is Anna Stern, and on behalf of the Shalom Sydney Jewish Writers Festival, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's panel interview with writers Hayley, Katzen and Bellamy, who will be interviewed by Benjamin Law. I'd like to acknowledge the Bedigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where Shalom is located, and show my respects to their elders, past, present and future. A very special welcome to our audience members from around Australia, to our regular attendees, and to anyone new who's joining the Shalom Sydney Jewish Writers Festival for the first time. And of course, a very, very warm welcome to our guest authors and moderator this evening. We're thrilled to have you with us. Thank you to everybody, all our audience members, for supporting the work that Shalom does by signing up and attending tonight's event, purchasing tickets and making donations. With your support, Shalom is able to continue enriching people's lives through cultural events like the Sydney Jewish Writers Festival. And I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of the JCA, the Jewish Communal Appeal, and we are grateful for their ongoing support and dedication to Jewish culture and engagement. Tonight's event is being pre-recorded, and if you would like to watch it again at a later stage, I'll be sending out a link with a password to everyone who bought tickets to this event so that you can watch it in your own time. We will only be sharing the password with people who've bought tickets. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our guests. I'll start with Hayley Katzen, the author of Untethered, whose book you can see here. Hayley's book Untethered, it's a memoir, is about her quest to find home. Hayley migrated from South Africa to Australia in 1989, and in 2005 she migrated again, this time to a cattle farm in the Australian bush. She had an extensive career as a law lecturer and researcher, and Hayley then studied acting and wrote and produced a play about asylum seekers. Hayley's short stories have been published internationally, and Untethered is her debut memoir. Welcome, Hayley, and congratulations on the publication of your book. Bellamy is a Melbourne-based writer, PhD candidate, and editor at Archer magazine. And Ros is also in the process of completing her debut memoir about gender diversity, Jewish identity, and mental illness. Ros describes their experience attending a modern Orthodox Jewish school as a queer and non-binary person in their essay Binary School, which appeared in the anthology Growing Up Queer in Australia. Welcome, Ros, and congratulations on having your essay included in the Growing Up Queer in Australia anthology. And lastly, we have our interviewer today, Benjamin Law, who many of you will be familiar with, celebrated author, journalist, and the editor of Growing Up Queer in Australia. Benjamin is a columnist as well for Fairfax's Good Weekend magazine and co-host of ABC-RN's weekly national pop culture show Stop Everything. Benjamin also frequently appears on TV shows such as The Project, Q&A and The Drum. And many of you will also be familiar with Benjamin's memoir, The Family Law, about growing up gay and Asian in Australia, which was then adapted for SBS TV. Both books, Untethered and Growing Up Queer in Australia, can be purchased from our official bookseller, Gertrude and Alice, and we'll share the link to make an online purchase with all of you after tonight's event. As I mentioned before, this is being pre-recorded, so there will be no Q&A at the end of the event. I hope that you all enjoy this evening's conversation about identity, belonging, writing, and a whole lot more. Thank you.
And good day, everyone, and welcome to the Shalom Sydney Jewish Writers Festival. I am Benjamin Law, and I'm very pleased and honoured to be joining you here from where I am on Gadigal land, which is part of the Great Eora Nation. First Nations Australians, of course, have been sharing knowledge and stories here on this continent for over 65,000 years, the longest continuing human civilization this planet's ever seen. And we're very, very privileged and honoured to be sharing stories and knowledge here with you today. Very grateful to elders past and present for that opportunity. So welcome to today's session of Growing Up Queer in Australia, where we're discussing the intersections of being Australian, Jewish and queer. Now, I do have a Hebrew name, but I am not Jewish, but I am very, very, very pleased that I can be a part of this session and talking to the both of you, Roz and Hayley. How are you going? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Wow.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation at how the different aspects of our identities cross over, affect and reflect each other. We've heard a little bit about your stories and about your work in the introductions already, but I also want to get a bit personal because this is what this session is about as well. So when we talk about growing up queer in Australia, I want to hear from both of you a little bit about where you grew up, what it was like, and also what were the attitudes or conversations around queerness when you were growing up. Let's start with you, Roz.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here on Wurundjeri land today during a lockdown and a very interesting time. So I grew up on Gadigal land in Sydney and lived there for the first 2.5 decades of my life and have ever since been living in Melbourne, which I love. Growing up in Sydney was an interesting experience. I lived in the middle of the eastern suburbs in the Jewish community and attended a modern Orthodox school while my family went to a very progressive synagogue. And so there was this kind of interesting, strange juxtaposition between a more conservative schooling and then a very progressive home and religious life. And growing up queer in those sorts of two frameworks was very confusing because what I learned at school, which was very minimal in terms of the LGBT plus community, sort of taught me one thing, which was to keep my crushes and any feelings that were queer to myself. And then at my synagogue, they started to be involved in things like the Sydney Mardi Gras. And there were couples in the congregation who were the same sex or gender. And putting all of that together was extremely confusing. And it took me quite a while to figure that out. And so I just kept it all very hidden. And so I quite like talking about it now because I spent those first kind of 20-25 years I kind of consider it quite repressed and thought of it as like, I guess something kind of shameful, and it took a long time to unpack that. And now I'm very much the other extreme and can't stop talking about queer. I bring everything back to queerness. And so it's a very different sort of experience now. And the people who know me now find it hard to kind of imagine what I was like back then. But it's been a big journey.
Roz, I want to talk more soon about those feelings that you're talking about, shame, the process of figuring it out yourself, and also, I guess, what I imagine many of us can relate to, which is thinking about it so much makes us actually have to process it, and how that conversation manifests out there, especially in your writing too. Hayley, I want to talk about where you grew up. Take us to the era and the area where you grew up on this planet, and those conversations about same-sex attracted people or otherwise too.
So I grew up in Johannesburg. I was, from quite a secular middle-class Jewish family. And to be honest, I don't even have a sense of having ever repressed lesbianism. I had no notion of myself having desire for a woman. And I don't know how much of that is related to growing up in a fairly repressed society as well. I mean, we were all labelled in particular ways by an apartheid government too. So I think what happened for me is that I came to live in Australia when I was 22. There was some family here, but I wasn't very connected to it. And in a way, I had the freedom from the expectations of who I was meant to be. And so a few months after arriving in Australia for the first time in my life, I had this extraordinary attraction to a woman. It blew me away, really. And I think, that's when I was at law school. started to come to Australia and I was studying graduate law, and it took me by complete surprise, but it was, it was unavoidably true, and it opened up my world. Suddenly everything I'd been told about desire and choice was just completely turned upside down. So I think, you know, for me, it was a really different experience. I didn't have many boyfriends at school. I did have one relationship with a boy at university, and a short relationship with a school teacher actually when I was at school. But I sort of didn't fit in lots of ways. And one of the guys I was friends with I worked in the left when I was at university in Cape Town. He said to me on the eve of my departure from South Africa, "Hayley, you can be whoever you want to be." And I think there was something about a massive change from one country to another, not having a mother around who was pretty watchful, that allowed me to make this change and to find more parts of myself.
This session that we're having right now, Hayley, is called Growing Up Queer in Australia. And there's a lot in that, the sense of being in Australia, the label queer, the idea that growing up takes place in a certain time frame in our lives. If you were to remix or rephrase growing up queer in Australia to what your experience was, how would you put it?
I think I've grown into being queer or lesbian. I have to admit that I've often... Now, I came out in 1989. I'm 54 now. So I think what we've seen is an enormous, you know, dynamism over the years. So I came out identifying as lesbian. I came out in a community where, you know, it was the gay and lesbian rights lobby. You know, that was the language we were involved in. So yes, I certainly feel like I've grown into my queerness. And I love the LGBTQI plus diversity as well, as, you know, that term, but we'll use queer here today. But yeah, I think I grew into it. I've found a way to integrate the different parts of myself over these years. And I feel like, you know, I've always stood very strong and visible, as you have, Roz. I think that's important for those of us who can articulate these issues. But yeah, I've grown into it.
I think you raise a really good point as well, Hayley, about language and what identities and labels we feel comfortable using and what we identify with as well. I imagine there are some people watching our session right now who might balk at queer because queer has been used also as a pejorative for a very long time. Probably increasingly with some generations and also where you are in the world as well. We're using it probably as the catch-all umbrella term in some ways and also as the discrete identity itself that many people identify as queer because the other parts of the rainbow spectrum don't necessarily quite flag with how they feel and how they identify. While we're talking about language, I'd like to hear your take, Roz. As you're growing up with those feelings that you described before, did you have a vocabulary for describing how you were feeling and how you identify yourself?
Yeah, queer definitely wasn't on my radar other than my very British grandmother using it in the pejorative sense, but also in a kind of, I don't know, not just pejorative. She used it to kind of talk about creativity and like anyone who was a bit odd and eccentric, which is something I value. So I don't know, I guess I came to the word queer knowing it was meant to be negative, but also even before I knew it could be associated with the community and with self-expression, having some questions around it and being quite intrigued by any term that I guess denotes eccentricity and creativity. But for myself, all the language was pretty intimidating because at my school, lesbian, gay, bisexual, bi were all used in a derogative way. I definitely didn't connect with any of those words and saw them all as things to definitely keep my distance from and kind of thought that associating with them would kind of taint myself and be a negative sort of attribute to have. And so that kind of slowed down the journey of realization as well, I think, for that reason. And so it wasn't until really after high school and being at uni and starting to see the word queer particularly being thrown around by the different student union groups and that sort of thing. And I wrote a piece for Queer Vertigo at UTS where I went, but I still wasn't really out to myself. It was a very weird time. So I started doing, I guess, I started using the word queer just in the sense of my writing and connecting to a community, but still not quite knowing how I identified. And then that in itself then turned out to be quite a long journey, because then I finally started feeling comfortable using lesbian. But then a few years after that was like, oh, actually bisexual is a more appropriate word for me. Queer became then after that a more inclusive umbrella term, but I still find it quite important to use the term bisexual and speak up, because the B is so often left out in the community. And Hayley mentioned that, you know, things back then were very much the gay and the lesbian, but it's still like that today. I won't go on a rant, but there are still many organizations that still are very kind of binary around those two terms. And so, yeah, it's been kind of a journey and a bit of a struggle as well to work out where to take that space.
Do you think the length of that journey and the struggle that you're talking about, Roz, has also been compounded with the availability or lack thereof of language? For instance, you know, your piece in Growing Up Queer in Australia is about binaries and challenging binaries. And as a non-binary person yourself who uses they, them, their pronouns, you know, that for me as a cisgender gay person, that for me, I feel like is something that's emerged more into common usage, maybe in the last 5 to 10 years. I think, like, if I'm honest with myself, I'm not sure cisgender was even in my vocabulary about 10 years ago. So how much of your personal understanding of yourself has been hampered by the lack of availability and wide usage of the language that's needed to identify yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's absolutely been hampered by it. And I think it's a big part of why I continue to write about these subjects over and over again. And it does get to the point where I kind of go to myself, I should start writing about other things. And I definitely am doing that. But in other times I sort of think, you know, representation, which is something that minority communities, you know, we feel like we have to talk about all the time. And so I kind of cringe even bringing up representation in a way, but there's still not adequate representation. And so we still need to continue to have that conversation. And I was thinking earlier before this panel about the fact that when I was growing up, the only kind of representation of Jews in books were American sort of culture. And then queerness or anything in the LGBTI plus community was pretty limited and pretty binary in itself as well. But queerness and Judaism together, absolutely unheard of. It just didn't exist. And so for me, it's just been so important to be loud and be kind of annoying in that way to make my identity really known, because I feel like there's just not enough still in the Jewish community in Australia. There's not enough understanding of queer identities, and in the queer spaces, I often feel like Judaism is just not understood whatsoever. And so I think, yeah, sorry, I've sort of gone on a tangent from talking about language.
No, it's a really good point, because as you're talking about that, Roz, it strikes me that as much as, of course, these are two separate identities that you hold at the same time, that there is a kind of almost a dovetailing of stories. I'm thinking as a storyteller now in terms of theme, because, you know, when it comes to a search for home, a search for safety, a search for safe harbor, that's very much the Jewish story. And that's also very much the story of us as queer people too. Hayley, I want to throw it over to you, because Untethered, your memoir, charts your search for these things, for home and safety and love as a migrant. We heard that you migrated from South Africa to Australia in the late 1980s. Yeah. Yes. And I'm wondering, you know, to what extent is your story a Jewish story and a queer story in terms of the themes?
I think, and I'm sorry, I think my internet is a bit unstable. I am in the country on satellite internet. So forgive me if I freeze. I missed some of you there, Ben. I think what I really was trying to write about in Untethered was that sense of multidimensionality, and for me, lots of dualities, you know, South African, Australian, all these questions of belonging. Certainly my Jewish identity, which has been a very private identity rather than a community-based identity. So to my work identities, which have been an important part of my home, and then also my identity as a woman and a feminist and as a lesbian. So I think what's I'm really conscious of in terms of my search for home and belonging is, you know, to what extent place is central to that. I got a great deal of strength from George Steiner's work when he talks about our homeland, the text. And for me, you know, my work, my writing has so much been my primary home. So I think, you know, we cross all sorts of dimensions as when we have all these different dimensions to us. It's how to find and how to anchor who we are. And, you know, that's where labels fall down. And that's why I'm really excited, Rose, by the whole non-binary and queer theory developments, because back when I was doing law reform, so this is The Bride Wore Pink, which is a discussion paper we did back in the early 90s, which was the first paper about legal recognition of lesbian and gay relationships. And at that stage, it was the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby and the Legal Rights Service. And the word bi, you know, there was a session to discuss whether we should include bi in that lobby's title. So, you know, what we recommended in that very first paper was a notion of significant personal relationship, which was to acknowledge all the relationships which didn't fit that sort of more, I kind of often think of it as that compulsory heterosexuality and that sort of binary definition. And, you know, obviously we didn't ever land up getting that through. And now we have, you know, we have marriage equality, which is great, but it is, you know, quite a binary in some sort of a way. And yeah, I find what's exciting is seeing how the language that you use, the non-binary language, would perhaps make some of the doubt and the challenge that I've certainly faced and so many of us face, it might take it away, because we could be all those things. We could have that multidimensionality more comfortably.
Hayley, I know a lot of people who are watching are so interested in your story but might not have necessarily read Untethered yet. So I'd like to talk more about the story of Untethered and what you write about there itself. You mentioned before, you alluded to leaving South Africa, leaving a more watchful family and finding that kind of freedom in Australia. Tell me what precipitated the move and what you found here and what you were looking for. Did it match your expectations?
So it is a complex story, as all migration stories are. My stepfather had sons who had moved to Australia with their wives, and he wanted to come and live in Australia. So my mum persuaded me that we should come, and I was able to get a visa. My father died very suddenly when I was 21, and I basically thought I needed to get the passport. You know, it felt like a passport to safety to come to Australia in that era of South Africa when we were, you know, it was a state of emergency. I was a young lefty at the University of Cape Town and had experience of protests and fear, really. I'm no hero when it comes to any of those things. So I decided to take that opportunity for a passport, and I came here. My mum wasn't ready to come yet, so they came later. And I guess I did have some family here, but it...
Uh-oh.
Oh, we may have lost Hayley. The country internet might be catching up. Let's just see if Hayley returns to us.
It was much more conflicted for me because she was watchful. So yeah, I guess that's I've had this struggle between the freedom that I've tried to claim myself, and, you know, I moved to the North Coast to a very different life as well to try and claim my freedom, as opposed to having the expectations that people had of me.
We lost you there just very briefly, Hayley, but we did get the gist of that arc and what you were telling us. But I just want to expand as well about this journey, because you were studying law. Well, you were practicing in law, and then you quit that to study acting. And now you're a city person who then moves to rural Australia on a cattle property to live with a farmer girlfriend to study writing. These are many, many different lives and iterations and literal chapters that you're moving through in the text. Does it kind of feel like you've had these different iterations of yourself? Because I know with, you know, migration, for us as queer people as well, we often, you know, have these whole different versions of ourselves as we move through our lives. Has that been how it's felt for you?
I think I have taken a long time to try and integrate all those different selves. And certainly moving to live on the farm with Jen. We've been together for 22 years, but I didn't live here for the first 5 years. We lived separately. When I moved here after a bushfire in 2005, yeah, I found that probably the most challenging move for me, because I am in a world where it's not my language. So I have a more intellectual language rather than a manual language. And although, you know, all these years later, I'm a bit more practical and a bit more able to work cattle and do those sorts of jobs, it's not really my métier, and it has been immensely challenging for me. So I think living here where people don't really, they don't really talk my language. They're not interested in the books and ideas that I'm particularly interested in. I felt much more isolated and alone. And I think one of the, I've been estranged from most of my family for a long time. My mum was my main anchor. Feel more untethered. And so it is about trying to find and integrate that past self, that present self, and try and make sense of all of that for oneself. So certainly here, it feels like on this farm, I've had the privilege of space and time, and also the challenge of it, as everybody knows from this COVID isolation time, to really make sense and meaning of life and all the different selves that I have, but I think that we all probably have.
I love hearing you articulate it that way. Roz, what about for you? I mean, we've heard that when you were younger, and your story in growing up queer starts as this mid-teenager kind of in love with everyone around them, and so interested about, you know, the possibilities there. I'm curious for you, you know, as you talk about the process and the struggle to understand who you are, what were the breakthroughs for you? For Hayley, it sounds like a lot of that was also about migration and also about the personal relationships that she had with Jen. What was it for you? Was it things that you read, people you met? What helped?
So many things. I had a little mini migration moving to Melbourne, and in a way that helped a lot because my wife's family are Orthodox, and when I moved here, we kind of got drawn in a little bit to the kind of what I'll call insular community of the Melbourne Jewish community. And I found that incredibly difficult. And I found it really hard to be myself. And I spent a number of years really struggling. And eventually, sorry?
I was about to ask you, what specifically did you find difficult?
So things like the way a person, either a woman or a person assigned female at birth, is expected to dress. Also going to synagogue events, women are separate from men physically, behind a curtain, or in some cases upstairs on a different level, separate from the men. And I found that incredibly difficult. I hadn't quite figured out my gender identity at all, but even identifying then as a woman, I found that really challenging as a feminist. I struggled a lot with that, even though at school that's the sort of Judaism that I had seen. I started to find myself coming up against it more and more. And so after a few years of just keeping my thoughts to myself, dressing the way I was expected, sitting behind that curtain with women, I stopped putting up with that, I suppose. And I became, I guess, louder about things at different events. I would question things pretty directly with the men in the community who held sort of what I saw as the power in different dynamics. And so that was a huge one for me. And then I suppose another one that I would bring up is my journey with mental illness. And even saying that, it's a very different answer to what I would have given you 5 years ago, where I would have talked about books and films and TV shows and how that helped me. But I feel now, and perhaps it's because I've just finished writing my manuscript as well, but I feel like I realize now how much mental illness has helped me put words to who I am, also step outside of comfort, and kind of embrace fear, and just, yeah, it's kind of made me, I guess, more able to articulate who I am and be less hampered by what other people think of me.
As I hear that, I'm wondering in the context for you, Hayley, this process of speaking up is really difficult for a lot of us, but obviously very necessary. And you've talked about being a protester in South Africa. You've been involved in what I saw before, like I guess a policy paper or a review of things to do with the lesbian and gay communities and the broader queer community. Where does your chutzpah, where does that fight come from with you? And when you do feel timid about them, how do you get it back up?
I think I felt very strongly out ever since I came out. Once I told my mother, I felt I could be out. And I felt visibility was really important. So I did get involved. My way into community, apart from, you know, dance parties and that sort of thing, was through activism. It's always been my route to belonging, really. What's interesting about that is, you know, I've been really visible always. I did a lot of law reform, a lot of public speaking about being a lesbian. But when I moved to live in the bush, I felt really differently. Some of that was because I'd come into Jen's world. She's been here for 40 years, and, you know, I've been here around her for 22 years. So she'd already had a long established life here. And in the bush, there is quite a lot of conservatism, and there are not a lot of LGBTQI plus people here. So I felt really out of a comfort zone. And that was challenging. I started volunteering at the local school and taught a drama group there, thinking, you know, that's some skill I've got that I can give in this community where I can't build fences as well as everyone else. And one of the little Aboriginal girls outed me and said to me, "Are you a lesbian?" And there she was sitting at a table with about 11 kids, and they all had to ask me this question. And I was at a complete loss. For someone who's, you know, spoken on many public platforms about being a lesbian and has been so out and proud, I just came undone with a bunch of primary school children. And I think that really sort of shocked me, just in terms of how challenging visibility is, and how much that sort of homophobia runs so rampant that we're very unsure of ourselves and when to speak out and when not to, and what the rules of engagement are in different environments. And
I imagine it's compounded by being in different environments. And part of what I read with Untethered is, of course, reflecting on estrangement, you know, estrangement from place, estrangement from people and its consequences. Have you felt the writing process, obviously it's reflecting and meditating on that estrangement, but have you actually found the writing process itself has helped you reconcile with those feelings, Hayley?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, Hilary Mantel in her wonderful memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, talks about reclaiming copyright in oneself. You know, I think a lot of writers, James Baldwin, all sorts of people have written about that need to have isolation or distance in order to come to terms with themselves and who they are, rather than other people's expectations of them. And I think the writing process certainly helped me to integrate those many selves, and to claim that copyright in myself, free of the expectations of others.
What about for you, Roz? Tell us about the role that writing plays for you. Is it simply reflecting things that you already knew, or does writing itself, that process, that act, become an act of discovery for you when it comes to topics like your Jewishness, when it comes to your queerness?
I think it's both. And I think the way that it serves as discovery is largely through metaphor and imagery. I kind of started to notice that, and I belong to a writers group where one in particular hammers at the point of precision in writing. And I realized that I have this tendency, when I kind of feel nervous in my writing, to slip into kind of reportage mode, and away from the more metaphoric and kind of symbolic mode. And so all the parts of my book that I'm working on where I've really written it in this very distanced reporter tone, I've had to go back in and really force myself to kind of look around me in that scenario and look at the things, bring meaning into all the different things that I'm encountering. And that process has brought so much discovery that I wasn't expecting. And I don't know what it is. It's a hard one to explain to myself. It involved a lot of late night writing where I was kind of sleepy and kind of slipped into like a different state. And maybe it's that creative state in a strange way, where I just pushed past that very analytical and intellectual way of looking at things and shifted into this very different mode that is hard to put words to. And when I would write in that mode, that's where I kind of found the richest discoveries. Whereas the more analytical mode is the stuff that I already knew, but I'm sort of retelling that for other people.
Now, we've only got about 10 to 15 minutes left to go in this conversation. So I want to stretch this conversation out a little bit more philosophically, actually. And I'll start with you, Roz. I get the sense that we are all, for better or worse, in this conversation at an age where we know queer people significantly younger and significantly older than us. And for you, Roz, you know, I've edited and you've been part of this anthology called Growing Up Queer in Australia. And one of the things I really wanted to do with this anthology was to make it multi-generational, so we could see and hear different perspectives from time. You know, we are not a monolithic community. Look at the various letters that make up our community. And so what have you been learning from queer communities younger and older than you lately?
That's a juicy one. Well, I feel like I, for many years, have learned a lot from younger queer communities, particularly around language. And I think a lot of that is that kind of social media and Tumblr kind of language that's helped me personally figure out language around gender and understanding myself in that way. But lately I have shifted more towards older generations. And I've had really interesting conversations during lockdown as well with people from communities that I've had less to do with in the past, like intersex communities, and discussions around the word queer and other terminology within the communities. And it's really broadened my mind to thinking about representation and belonging and the way that umbrella language, even though it really helps me, how it can be unhelpful to other parts of the LGBTIQA+ acronym. And so I think hearing more from older communities, and particularly the word lesbian as well, and I'm really glad Hayley's talked so much about lesbian identity today, but speaking to older lesbians as well about their experiences, realizing that there was a part of my life where lesbian identity was really important to me. And even though I ended up realizing bisexual was more appropriate, that lesbian is like an incredibly political identity as well. And I think often it's some of the older generations within the queer community who have helped me see that, and also see how the way has been pathed as well. The way that I guess seeing the struggle politically and historically, and the way that I owe so much and have so much gratitude for those generations.
What about you, Hayley? What are your impressions of the older and younger LGBTIQA plus communities in Australia, and how different are they to your experience of being queer in this country?
I think I mean, Jen's 11 years older than me, so she's 65 this year. And so some of our friends are well into their 70s or, you know, getting close to 80, as well as, you know, friends who are in their 30s and 40s. So I think what I love about the LGBTQI+ is that it allows diversity, and it allows everybody to identify as they please. And I think that's a powerful way for us all. I think labels are often how we define who we are. I certainly know that for myself. I think the young Aboriginal girl who was challenging me about my lesbianism was probably trying to work something out for herself. So I think there is some, you know, labels are imposed on us. I certainly know that as a South African, but, you know, they're also a way we help ourselves through things. I think it's just how to embrace diversity. I remember when, you know, when the research was being doing, the community consultations were happening around lesbian parenting. And I remember sitting in a room in Lismore with a bunch of lesbian mummies, and I'd insisted Jen come along with me, even though, you know, we certainly weren't, she wasn't interested in having children. And Jen's kind of sense of it all was, if I was going to have a child, it would be me on, she didn't want to be a mother. It wasn't her thing. It was for me to do it. And where she came from was so much from the era when women were losing their children to male partners through the family court because they were lesbian. So I think all those layers of our history are hugely crucial. And so too, you know, I've watched friends transgender, and there are all those changes, and we've all needed to learn and expand our own vocabulary and understanding. So diversity is what our community is about. It's what I love about it. You know, for me, being queer, being lesbian, it's a joy. It's not a disability, for God's sake. It's something that I really celebrate. It hasn't been the challenging thing for me. It's been other people's attitudes to it that are challenging. So, yeah.
And the LGBTIQA plus communities are not a monolith, similar in the way that it strikes me that the Jewish communities here in Australia and around the world are not a monolith. And both of you represent very different experiences of being a part of the Jewish community. Hayley, you were talking about being raised in a more secular family, and as time has gone on, you've talked about the more separation that you feel from that community. Roz, as time goes on, you have a lot of contact through your extended family with an Orthodox with the Orthodox Jewish community. I'm curious for both of you. Let's start with you, Hayley. Are there aspects of your Jewish identity or growing up Jewish that has actually helped you understand something about your queerness as well, or vice versa?
Interesting question. Yeah, I guess some of it is, so although I've not been very involved in Jewish life, I still maintain that Jewish identity very strongly. And, you know, I love to light the candles on a Friday night, even though we often go down to the community hall for the beer and bar, you know, barbecue and bar. And I certainly will light yahrzeit candles for all my loved ones. So Jewish identity is still, you know, it's very important and significant for me. I think it's quite a private identity for me. So it's not something that I'm celebrating publicly, whereas I suppose I have been more part of queer community than I have of Jewish community. So I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, Ben.
No, I think it's a really interesting thing to meditate on. I love that you're doing this for us.
I think, you know, I did when I first came to Australia and some of my family stuff had got a bit too complicated. I did look to a Jewish lesbian group for belonging. And I sat at a table. I had a Seder at the house where my girlfriend and I were living, and my mum came along, but it wasn't right for me. It was something about being in the shadow of something that I'd once felt kind of safe within that made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't want to seek belonging through Jewishness. I wanted to fit in with my Australian friends, and they were largely non-Jewish. So yeah, I think Jewishness is interesting. When I went to Melbourne, I decided I couldn't keep living on the farm in 2016, and Jen and I didn't split up in any way, but I went to Melbourne, and I went to shul because I had a friend who just died and I wanted to do say Kaddish for her. And I kind of realized that it didn't actually, didn't help me in the way that it had in the year when I'd first come to Australia and I'd gone to say Kaddish for my dad every Friday night at a progressive shul. But I went then with one of my Melbourne friends. Her daughter was part of a kind of a really different Jewish group, and I went along to their service, which was really different from everything I'd ever known as a shul. And so I started to understand the many different ways one could go and see that if I wanted to pursue that direction, which many of my Jewish lesbian friends have, that there was an openness. And I guess this event by Shalom, I'm pleased that it's there because I suppose there is more openness than I ever understood before.
Thank you so much for sharing, Hayley, and for going into the nuances of that story too. And Roz, what about for you? You've illuminated some of the complications between Jewish identity and queer identity, but has being Jewish illuminated things about queerness for you and vice versa in any other way?
Yeah, absolutely. One big way I think is around my identity as what my family are from Russia, Ukraine, parts of Eastern Europe, and that identity as kind of a Russian Jew, and the way that I suppose my mum and her migration and her family story, they didn't quite fit into the Jewish community when they came here. And so I think from a young age, I sort of did associate the Jewish community with not belonging and feeling different and feeling othered in many ways. And so I think part of that for me part of the journey has been starting to, I suppose within the Jewish community, find, like Hayley talks about, finding spaces that feel safer and feel embracing. And for me, that involved a decade of just removing myself completely from the community and then coming back to it, knowing, I guess, who I am and what I feel comfortable around and what I don't. And then I've been able to bring that into my queer life as well. And one big way that came to mind when you were talking about it before, Ben, was what is actually around discrimination and experiences of anti-Semitism or homophobia, queerphobia. And it's a strange one, but it's one that is actually quite helpful because I've learned lessons in one area that I can then apply to the other. And it's a sad one to bring up, but it's one that I suppose many people would identify with as well. And I guess developing strength in one helps you kind of feed that into the other. And that's something I've had to do in workplaces where there's surprising amounts of ignorance still, and then bringing that into other spaces like faith-based spaces and community spaces, and being more able to speak up and call things out. And that's been a big part of it for me. So less about, I suppose, where I was 10 years ago, which was walking into a seder or a synagogue and feeling really uncomfortable. And instead, now if I choose to go, I go in fully informed, knowing who the people are, I suppose, knowing what things might come up and what I might need to challenge and call out, and being prepared to do that. And it's something that I don't feel like I would have in the Jewish community without my queer life, and vice versa. And so they're both incredibly important to me and feed into each other in ways that, and I know they'll continue to do so throughout my life.
That's incredibly astute, Roz. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and how, you know, our various communities suffer trauma and have experienced trauma and discrimination. And the flip side of that, of course, is resilience and endurance and capacity to be able to speak up and resist. I want to leave on a final note of asking each of you, if you could get in a time machine and go back in time and talk to a younger baby version of yourself, what age would you want to go back to, and what kind of pep talk would you be giving this younger queer or queer nascent version of yourself? What would you want that younger version of yourself to know? Can we start with you, Roz?
Yeah, that's a really fun activity. And it actually reminds me of Nevo Zisson's book, where, yeah, the final
Finding Nevo, yes.
Yeah. I think for me, it would be age 12, bat mitzvah age, and where I was feeling really annoyed and conflicted about what I saw was different for girls and boys at that time. And I think I would say to myself, you're right, and this school isn't right for you. You need to kind of veer paths now, and it's okay to tell your parents that this isn't working. Like, get out of there, go and just be yourself somewhere, and don't spend the next 10 years like trying to be who you think other people want you to be.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And what about you, Hayley? What period of time or what age would you want to go back to? And what would you be telling this younger version of Hayley?
Gosh, fascinating question, Ben. Yeah, because I had no conception of lesbianism, other than my mother talking about a cousin who had a disability, and she said she was a lesbian, and she kind of attributed the disability to the lesbianism to the disability. So I suppose I would like to go back to being, you know, kind of 9 or 10, and just knowing that I could make any choice for myself, and I could speak out about anything I wanted to speak out. So I would go right back there and know that, yeah, everybody's expectations didn't matter, and I needed to find what I wanted for myself.
What a beautiful lesson. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Hayley. Thank you, Roz, as well. Hayley, Katzen, Roz, Bellamy. Thank you so much for sharing both of your stories and your wisdom with us, with this Goy in particular. Very, very grateful. And thank you so much for the Shalom Sydney Jewish Festival for hosting this session today. This has been Growing Up Queer in Australia, and thank you so much for all of your time.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. That was really wonderful. Ben, I loved your sprinkling of Yiddish expressions throughout. That worked perfectly. And Hayley and Roz, an enormous thank you to you both for participating. And I really appreciated the frankness and honesty in the conversation and your willingness, both in your writing and in today's conversation, to be so open with us and to delve so deeply into issues before an audience that you're not familiar with and moreover can't see. So thank you very much to both of you. And Ben, thank you again for putting all of this together, for the pertinent questions and the preparation and research you did. Wonderful to have you all with us. And that was, again, a wonderful conversation. I also wanted to say that I appreciated the question and the discussion you had about what one can learn from older and younger generations. And in a way, I think it's a very Jewish question as well, this connection between generations, what one passes on and what one, receives from other generations. So I thought it was just an interesting point for all of you to stop at this point in your lives and to reflect on that. Both Hayley's book, Untethered, and the anthology Growing Up Queer in Australia, which Roz contributed to, are available for purchase from Gertrude and Alice. And I'll mention as well that Growing Up Queer has a collection of essays from a number of notable, well-known Australians, including Holly Throsby, David Marr, and many others. So I highly recommend reading both books. Thank you to our audience always for, as I said, attending, for supporting, and for your interest in today's event and all our other events. Tonight couldn't have happened as well without significant contribution from the Shalom Sydney Jewish Writers Festival team and our programming committee of volunteers made up of Rita Nash, Michaela Kolowski, and Adam Van Rooyen. And I'm very grateful to my colleagues and to our volunteers for their dedication to the Shalom Sydney Jewish Writers Festival. We have many more events coming up in the next couple of weeks and months, and so I'll be sending out more information after tonight's event, and I hope you'll be able to join us again. Once again, thank you for being here tonight. I hope you keep well, and I hope that we get to see you again very soon, either in person or online. All the best. Bye-bye.